Hey there, spooky friends, and welcome to another episode of the Scaryish podcast.
Woo!
I'm Robin Grace, that's Adam Diaz.
Hello.
We are a podcast that, chit-chats about weird things, creepy things, paranormal things, sometimes real life things like freaking murder.
Indeed. Like what just happened on Monday Night Football. We're recording as soon as Monday Night Football on October 24th concluded. I'm a huge Bears fan. Everyone knows that. My team has sucked balls this year, but they somehow beat the New England Patriots. That's why I wooed so loud. I didn't even know we started recording. It's crazy.
Well, you know why though, right? Because they no longer have Tom Brady.
I mean, they haven't had Tom Brady for a while, and they've been doing okay. But, this isn't a football podcast. Most people that are listening right now are like, stop talking about the foosballs. Like Robin said, we talk about weird stuff. We're going to be talking about some stuff like that. Robin, what are you going to be covering this episode?
I'm going to be covering some haunted churches. I got a few here in the, what are those things? In the quiver, I guess.
Okay, a few arrows in your quiver.
Arrows of churches.
Do you have a take me to church joke in there, or should I save it for later?
No, I don't have a take me to church joke. But I mean, when I discovered or figured out what I was going to do this episode, I was making churches chicken jokes.
Okay, I like that. I like where your head's at. So.
Yeah. Yep.
Right on. I am excited. That's perfect for spooky season. And speaking of perfect for spooky season, I'm going to be covering Edgar Allan Poe. And I will say I'm going to be covering his life briefly, the mysterious, bizarre death he suffered, and then theories about what could have happened to him. I am excited to cover that. I also want to go ahead and put out there a big thank you to everyone who listens and everyone who supports us and everyone who follows us on social media. There was a death in the family last week. It's actually been about 10 days. I can't really think through it, but
has it really?
Yeah. And so
it's been a little over 10 days. Oh my God. Yo. Okay. So let me also tell you about the scary thing that happened to me last night that never, ever happens. Okay. I have left. So sometimes I leave the window open because it's nice and cool outside, and I prop my curtain open with a tissue box, and normally nothing ever happens to said tissue box. It always just, it's shoved in a way that it doesn't blow off of my windowsill. And last night at exactly on the dot, 3 a.m, I hear something toppling to the floor. And I guess my curtain somehow got blown so hard the tissue box fell onto the floor at exactly 3 a.m. last night.
It's not that wind can't blow hard enough to knock a tissue box off a windowsill.
But I was watching that curtain for minutes afterwards, and it was not blowing anymore.
It's just
like it blew that.
Yeah, one gust of wind, perfectly timed to 3 a.m., that's strong enough to do it, and then is not followed up by any further gusts of wind is,
and
a little bit creepy.
So I thought, maybe someone's trying to break in. And so I got up, shut my window, locked it, went to the restroom, and as soon as I came into my room, I heard creaking outside, and I was like, oh God, either someone else is awake or this is how I die. So, as any other sane person would do, I put on Modern Family.
Wow.
To stay up again for another 30 minutes before I tried to go back to sleep because I was too afraid to sleep. But now that you bring that up, it's been 10 days. I think in my culture, there's something about 10 days and spirits. And maybe, I was just telling Adam earlier, maybe it is the spirit of my uncle just playing one last trick on me and just laughing about it. Because I was absolutely terrified.
That would be a very him thing to do. She was telling me about that story, and I was just like, it's not that these things can't happen. It's just that the timing of it, combined with the timing right now, is definitely something that is creepy. And, I totally understand why you would find it hard to go back to sleep. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all our followers because we, messaged that, or we posted that the episode's going to come out late due to the things that were happening and all the family that was coming into town and, trying to figure out what was going on. And everyone was super supportive, and they're just like, take all the time you need, take off the week if you guys need to, because we were originally just going to delay the episode by 24 hours. And after sitting down and thinking about it, and so many people were in town, Robin was in town, and, it was something where we realized this time is better spent elsewhere and away from the show, unfortunately. And we felt comfortable doing that because of how understanding everyone was. So Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it. So that said, one last thank you to everyone for understanding. We didn't have an episode last week, and it's been a minute since that happened. So for this particular week, which is the week leading up to Halloween, I'm going to have this episode come out early. So this episode's coming out on Tuesday, which is no longer our official release day. We do these on Wednesday now. And then we're also going to have the last couple episodes of Storytime Bloodlines launch this week. They'll be leading up to Halloween, so we can have something sort of creepy there for you guys, since we're not going to be doing a reading this particular spooky season. But we are going to be going over the life of Edgar Allan Poe rather than doing one of his stories. So kind of fun stuff. 3 episodes this week as a thank you to folks for understanding and as penance for missing an episode. That's about what's been going on in our lives. It's been pretty complicated outside of the show right now. If anyone hears growling or any noise like that, I have a Corgi and a Shiba Inu in the office with me in this tiny little room. They've been very clingy today. I don't know why, but it's too adorable for me to kick them out. I tried, and they're pawing at the door, so they're in here with me right now. But
cute, jealous.
I think Robin's going to be going first this particular episode, so we will all sit here quietly and listen. So take it away.
All right. So Halloween, of course, is right around the corner for us here, and it's a day that's pretty noted with everybody dressing up, ghosts, skeletons, decorations, splash of headstones here and there, spider webs, big ol' spiders, just creepy decorations, right? Anytime it's Halloween time, you just see that absolutely everywhere. I love Halloween. I love Halloween decorations. Or for some, it's just decorations because it's just what you're into.
Some people just love that stuff. I will also point out, just a quick side note, if anyone wants to know about like the history of Halloween, check out episode 99 where I cover it. Robin also covered the BTK killer in that episode, so it could be a fun time for you. Anyways, sorry.
All right. I know I personally have some creepy things that I leave up all year round because I love, some creepy things. Part of it is because that's just the podcast we have, and so our decorations just happen to just be that constantly. But there are also haunted houses during Halloween. Super creepy haunted houses. I know you definitely see that everywhere. But I don't know if you see a lot of haunted churches as like a prop, or as, you don't have come see us in this haunted church. It's usually like come visit this haunted house where they'll scare your pants off. But horror movies, I feel like, make a really good point of using the symbols and everything that kind of represents the church as, something scary. Or things that like the church considers evil, how they use like upside down crosses and things like that. But not necessarily churches themselves are pointed out as spooky or creepy or haunted. It's usually the holy place that everyone ends up running to during all these movies and TV shows, things like that.
I would say too, like you're 100% right. And in movies, when things get really creepy, it's when someone goes to hide out in a church and creepy things happen in the church. Because anytime I see that, I'm like, it's supposed to be safe.
Like The Nun, that movie, where they go to the church and everything awful happens within the church. I think that is one of the movies that has come out recently that has given that haunted church story. But if you've listened to us quite a long time here, you'll know that there are indeed a good amount of haunted churches out there. So I thought it'd be fun this Halloween to cover some more of these haunted churches. I feel like I haven't really covered one in a while. So here's a bunch to throw at you all at once, I guess.
Right on. Let's do it.
So the first one here is that of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Cleveland, Tennessee. In particular, it's the mausoleum of this churchyard that tells a sad yet haunting tale. So, legend has it that on St. Luke's Day in 1871, a man named John Craig Miles, he was the head of a prominent family in Cleveland, Tennessee, and he decided to take his granddaughter Nina out for a carriage ride as kind of a treat. And while on this ride, they happened to be in a deadly accident. So they were supposedly crossing some railroad tracks when their carriage got stuck and couldn't move, and a train just happened to run through these railroad tracks without warning, taking Nina's life, with her grandfather surviving. I guess he was able to escape. She wasn't. The family was absolutely heartbroken and decided to have a church built in her honor, which ended up being St. Luke's Episcopal Church. So a mausoleum was built, and it was built as kind of a symbol of Nina, right? They used this beautiful Italian imported white marble, and they used this really clean white marble to kind of symbolize the loss of Nina and just the death of this innocent child. And it's really important to note that they chose white specifically. They wanted white marble. Shortly after the completion of the mausoleum, strange red streaks began to appear within the marble.
Oh shit, this is getting creepy.
So the first reports of these strange red streaks described it as if the marble was actually bleeding itself. It looked like blood was coming through the marble. And if you look at images of the mausoleum today, you'll notice that there are large patches of this red and these streaks going through the marble. And these marks can't be scrubbed away despite people trying. Despite scientists investigating and examining the marble, there's no explanation as to why this marble has turned red. There's no chemical explanation. There's nothing that would explain why it would turn red the way it has. And people have tried to clean it and it just won't go away, which is terrifying. But if we'll post pictures later, but it's a very strange looking red on this mausoleum.
Is it like dried blood red, or is it just like discoloration? Would you say it looks like blood, or would you say it just looks like an odd red?
It looks like, you know how in horror movies and stuff like that, you see like the red smears on things?
Yeah. I always assume that's blood.
Yeah, it's kind of what it looks like, but it's more blotchy, I guess. But it does look like that crusty, dry blood looking color. Okay. Like that darker, when you leave blood out too long.
Yeah, because, everyone's left a jar of blood out of their fridge for too long, and all of a sudden it gets all deep red.
Yeah. But locals do have their beliefs as to why this has happened. They think that the red stains are related to young Nina, and that red is like a sign that her ghost resides within the church's mausoleum, which is sad. But if her spirit is there, it's like, oh, my family built this church and this mausoleum for me. How cool.
Yeah, it's like, it is sad, but at the same time, she doesn't feel forgotten, maybe.
Yeah. So the second one here is not going to be located here in the United States, but across the pond in Clophill, Bedfordshire in England. And there's an old village there that has the remains of an abandoned church of St. Mary the Virgin. And the locals refer to this church as Old St. Mary's or the Old Parish Church. And it is definitely a shell of what it once was, but it was built in around 1350. So it's been around a while, and it's pretty impressive that so much of the stone structure still stands. It probably has something to do with the fact that people have poured money into keeping this property up. It's a historical monument, so they're taking care of it, maintaining it, making sure it doesn't go to shit, pretty much. But apparently, this church has a little bit of a darker and more sinister story to it in comparison to our first one, which is sad considering someone died in the first one. First things first, this church was apparently built facing the wrong direction. And I don't know anything about church construction or proper positioning, but according to the interwebs, and a lot of videos I've watched in the past couple days, it wasn't correct. So supposedly churches are traditionally built facing the east. which is the direction of the rising sun, which is supposed to kind of mark the location of heaven. Or it's like if Jesus were to have a second coming, that's where he would come from. And so there was something that I was watching today where gravestones, like cemeteries, are lined up a certain way, and they're called headstones because that's where your head goes. But the way they made the cemeteries is if you were to rise yourself because of the second coming of Christ or whatever, the way you would rise and your face would face the east.
I did not know that at all. That's good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really fascinating. I had no idea about all this stuff, but so the altar within this church needs to be in the direction to which people will pray, and the holy direction, one might say, is the east in this case. So there were other sources that said it's supposed to be facing Jerusalem. I don't know about that because there was only one source that I saw that said that, but I'm not sure. Again, not an aficionado of church construction, so I'm really not sure exactly. But either way, this church was built in the wrong direction. Some say that simply based on its direction alone, away from God, it is therefore opening its doors to the gates of hell. Which I think is a little bit overkill, saying that, because you built it in the wrong direction, you're literally opening the gates to hell. But it probably plays a part in the rumors that satanic rituals have been performed in this area. Another strange feature of this church is that nearly all the gravestones from the graveyard sit against like a side of the graveyard. Apparently, the area was cleared of its gravestones during the 1970s after there were incidents of graveyard desecration, which is awful. Apparently in 1963, the graves of 6 women were dug up by supposed local Satanists and used to perform a black mass at the church. Obviously, this is all, assumptions that some Satanists dug it up. It could have been, rowdy teenagers or anybody really that did it. But a skeleton was supposedly left behind within the church. The rector had to speak to the press after 2 kids were seen playing with a skull in the street.
What the fuck?
Yeah. So this was when he kind of confirmed the bones that they found within the church. Those gravestones, those headstones, it's kind of spooky to have them all kind of laying where they don't belong or standing where they don't belong. We'll post pictures again later, but there are pictures of them like kind of lined up on the edge of a bush. It's very strange, like they're lining a walkway. And if I walked past that, I'd probably be pretty scared. But having their headstones moved like that, I would assume would lead to some pretty unhappy ghosts, some pretty unhappy spirits, because it's like, I don't know, disrespect in a way. Because now it's like they're not labeled or anything. It's like, people are going to forget them, at least if I were a ghost, that's how I would feel if someone's like, I'm just going to move this, no big deal. It's like
tampering with someone's supposedly eternal resting place is just a big no-no across the board, regardless of like whether it's just being respectful or like anything involving religion. It's just like, leave them alone, let them rest there.
Right. And if those poor women, their bodies were actually used in any sort of unholy rituals, that would definitely call for some really spooky ghost activity, some paranormal activity, if you may. Later that same year, a young student admitted to having killed a rooster, I think. It's called a cockerel, which is like a male chicken, which is a rooster, right? And he admitted to sprinkling its blood inside the church. So, stuff did happen within this church. People did do things within this church. I'm sure he didn't perform any ritual. I'm sure it was just something like, oh, see me do this, watch me do this, or something. You know what I mean? Kids being kids.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like, a kid not knowing what the instructions are to perform some sort of ritual, so they just do shit that they've heard of as being like, creepy or like spooky, part of a ritual, like, sprinkling the blood of a rooster around a church, which is just unsanitary and gross.
Right. This church was abandoned after a replacement church was built in a more convenient location during the 19th century. Though many people did abandon this church once that happened, some continued to worship there. This was when it became more of a mortuary chapel than a practicing church. They would hold bodies there before they buried them in the adjacent cemetery. These days, though, it's obviously no home to any church service. People don't go there for church. It has no roof. It's just like an open frame of stone. A few items, including 2 church bells, were moved to the new church. So the new church does have pieces of this old one. By the 1950s, the church was declining so much that it couldn't even function as a mortuary chapel anymore. And then came the graveyard desecration and the supposed satanic activity. And during this time in history, it really wasn't uncommon for these types of stories to be spread about churches all over Britain. I mean, I know over here in America, we had the Satanic Panic, all that stuff. So it's something that I don't think is very out of the ordinary for people to be spreading rumors like that. Later, rumors involved the church having been built on a leper colony, which I think is weird. It's something that's not confirmed or given any definitive fact. I don't know where people got that information from. But despite a lot of these things being rumors, it didn't stop the church from garnering a lot of negative, like a bad reputation, a lot of negative connotation with this church. It just wasn't as holy a location as one would assume of a church, especially, I mean, I'm sure when someone was like, dude, it's built in the wrong direction, people were like, I'm outie, no thanks, you know? The building is now a grade 2 protected and historic structure, with the responsibility of its maintenance being held in the hands of the Bedfordshire Central Council. These days, the location is more of like a paranormal investigator tourist attraction. A lot of people going there just to see if they could find ghosts or evidence that something like that exists. But still not immune to the occasional act of vandalism, which is really sad.
That is sad.
But it happens all over the world, right? People just want to destroy things.
What do you say? 300 patrons will go there?
No.
Gosh, I can't get
One
you to
day
set
I'll
any
go to
goals anymore.
England. Maybe if we go to Ireland, we can go to some castles and stuff, and maybe some of them are haunted. Who knows? But, all right. So this last church for my little haunted church topic here, it's more based around horror and disaster than the church itself. The activities, the actions that happened here did involve the church, and the whole area seems to be haunted. Okay. So we're going to take a train from Britain. I'm sure, you know, back in the day, you couldn't have taken a train across the ocean, but we're going to go to the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane. It's probably wrong. I don't speak French, but Godspeed to me. Okay. On the afternoon of June 10th, 1944, way back in the day, which isn't even that far back in the day. It's not even 100 years ago. It's less than 100 years ago.
It's less than 80 years ago.
642 men, women, and children were massacred by troops from the German Army's 2nd SS Panzer Division. Nazi soldiers left their victims where they lay while they looted the entire town and set it on fire before leaving. So they killed every single person in this village except for about 6 people. 6 people survived this whole thing.
Jesus Christ.
So these survivors were able to survive thanks to just lucky happenstances. One was able to survive by hiding in a bush despite having been shot multiple times. A man and a few others stayed hidden under bodies of other people that were shot, something that happens during wartime all the time. No one really knows why they killed an entire village, why they did this to this entire village. It was fairly out of the way compared to some other locations. It was out of the way of any major war conflicts. So it was very odd that they did this to this village. Supposedly, the group of soldiers left their camp, which was about 6 miles away. So they left their camp that morning, and their excuse was that they were going to go pick up an SS officer that had supposedly been captured and held there. at this village. So senior officers ordered everyone into the town square to present their papers, something that Nazis did back then, to verify, what race you were, which is so messed up. From here, it's not really certain what initiated the massacre, but they began to lock women and children in the church, while the men were sent to a number of large barns spread throughout the village. And they gunned down all the men in these barns and set them on fire.
Jesus Christ.
The barns on fire. Something not so uncommon for Nazis to have done at the time, because they used to line people up and just murder them.
Yeah, as a reminder, the Nazis committed vile atrocities. Like Robin already mentioned, this isn't even like 80 years ago. This is fairly recent, and these people were just straight up evil. It's awful.
The women and children kind of had it worse. Apparently, they were left in this church with what seemed to be a bomb. The bomb did not work, so it just set the church on fire. And it is reported that they just let the church burn with everyone inside. And if anybody tried to escape, then they would shoot them, which is so fucked up. Adolf Diekmann was the officer in charge of this group at the time, this Nazi group, and during his war crimes trial, he claimed that the massacre was purely because they had kidnapped one of his officers. This apparently was accepted as his answer, and none of the men involved served more than 14 years in prison for all their war crimes.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, when the survivors learned that they weren't going to get killed, they protested against the French government, and they were like, we don't want to be French anymore if this is how it's going to be. Which I can totally understand, Unfortunately, everyone that was involved is deceased, I believe, so we can't really ask any more questions or find out, if maybe on one of their deathbeds they were like, this is really what happened or whatever. But it seems like it was most likely some sort of personal vendetta against all these people. Like, I don't know why this Diekmann guy was just wanting to kill so many people. Who knows? The massacre ended this village's existence. Following the war, the French president Charles de Gaulle ordered the village to be left as is to serve as a memorial to the innocents who were killed that day. There are signs on various buildings that, like, the remains of the buildings anyway, that kind of show each structure, what they were, and they're just memorials to what happened there. A new village was built nearby. The residents there call the old one the Old Village or the Village of Martyrs. The people that lived in the new village wore mourning clothes for years after the massacre, and all their buildings were painted gray on purpose to kind of mourn the whole thing. None of the residents of the new village go to the old one after dark. They say that there are spirits that roam the streets at night. Some say that they can stand at their windows in their houses, at their windows in their village. They look out onto the old village and see dark spirits walking around the streets. And they also claim to be able to smell burned wood and flesh as they walk through the village as well.
Jesus.
Which is very distinct, I'm sure.
Yeah. I'm happy to say I don't know the smell of burnt flesh, but I would imagine that if you smelled it, you'd probably never forget it.
I don't know if they still do this, but visitors and people from the village, they leave gifts as offerings to appease the dead along the roads. I can't imagine living in the village next door because to me, it's like, that's asking to see haunted things, especially being next to a place that had so much horror happen there. The village was destroyed by fire, and it was so difficult to identify everyone that was lost. So I would assume being left unidentified would also leave one's spirit to wander and wonder, like, what's going on? You know, where am I? What am I going to do? The ruins of the church must just be the absolute pinnacle of hauntings there because of the souls that were trapped in this building. 247 women and 205 children were killed that day.
Jesus Christ.
Imagine that many people in that church.
That's horrific.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrific. If that area wasn't haunted, I would be absolutely surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if you could hear wailing and screaming in the middle of the night because that place is so haunted. I mean, if you guys have listened to us for long enough, you know me and the idea that horrible things, hauntings, are just echoes of horrible things that happen through time. And so you would probably hear all that, you know? But that's just me. Everybody can have their own idea of how ghosts work. But hundreds of thousands of people visit this place every year. I don't know since the pandemic, but it's definitely something that would be humbling and really interesting to see. If any of you folks have ever gone there, let us know. I can't even imagine what the vibe feels like there. Like, what does the air feel like? I'm sure you can feel like that heavy energy, or maybe it's a little bit suffocating to be there. But signs around the village remind visitors to show respect while you're there and just, you know, bask in the ambiance, I guess.
Yeah, I have always kind of subscribed to your idea about like some sort of traumatic event leaving a scar on a specific place that echoes throughout time. And this would be something that I think definitely applies to this area. It's almost smart that, you know, I should say it's almost smart. I think it's very smart that they stated we're not going to try and build on top of this village that was like had this horrific thing occur, because it's almost as if they know better. To say like, you know, leave this as a place for them to rest in some way, shape, or form, and then, you know, form a new village where they can honor the memory of the old one, because that's a horrific story. It really is. Like, war crimes are always committed, but this is like on a different fucking level. That's horrible.
During World War II, stuff like this happened a lot. And this is just small potatoes compared to some of the other atrocities, you know. There was all the different internment camps and things that happened during World War II. So Nazis were not good guys, man.
There's a reason why in video games there's always been two things that you're allowed to shoot, and it gets past all the ratings boards. One is monsters, and the second is Nazis. And it's because Nazis are essentially human monsters. Like the Wolfenstein series, which is one of the first-person shooters ever created, was a mixture of both of those things. And then when they went to make Wolfenstein again in like 2019, you know, they hyped it up like, hey, like, come kill Nazis. And people were like, oh, I didn't realize Wolfenstein was going to be political. And then they replied like, we didn't think Nazis would have made a comeback in the 21st century. So who would have guessed it? Because it's like, it is horrific to think anyone could still subscribe to the mindset that those fucking people would do this in the name of. And just so many, not just lives taken and like during a war, which is something that happens, but just innocent people slaughtered for ridiculously awful reasons. And like you said, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
I mean, I know we're not a political podcast, but the rise of like anti-Semitism, like I fucking can't even right now.
Yeah, we're very apolitical, but I'll say, I'm gonna go on a limb here and say fuck Nazis. So I think that's a pretty safe bet to make. And if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I think that was a little risque, probably not the show for you, just saying.
But yeah, that is just a couple or a few tales of haunted churches, or, you know, horrifying events through history.
Indeed. Macabre, for sure. Morbid, absolutely. Entertaining, yeah. Good job,
Macabre.
Macabre, as
shout
it's
out to my
stated
sister.
by her little sister. But yeah, solid topic, and definitely one to have leading up to Halloween. So, all right, before we get into my topic, we're going to take a quick commercial break, so we'll see you on the flip side. And we are back, which means this is the flip side. Back. So you've been flipped. So like I mentioned, this week, I decided that I was finally going to cover a long-awaited topic that I think everyone has been expecting us to do. In fact, I thought we had already covered this. Robin also thought it was possible we already covered this. And people have asked us, like, you covered that, right? I will say, anytime something like this occurs, I think we mentioned this a few times in the past, we do a very deep dive on all of our previous episodes. We check all the episode titles to see if something like, Edgar Allan Poe pops up. And if not, then we think, like, what sort of, like, category topics could it have been in? And we go through all those as well. We check our scripts, we listen to the shows, just to make sure we're not covering something twice. That said, we've definitely mentioned Edgar Allan Poe because we've read 2 of his stories for like Halloween specials in the past. And, it's a very interesting topic and he tends to come up a lot. But I don't think we've ever sat down and actually gone over Edgar Allan Poe as a topic. And since, right now it's spooky season, I think it's about time. Jess, Robin's roommate out in Cali, was talking about all the crazy stuff surrounding him, I think a couple months ago. And she was like, did I hear this on your show? I was like, this is new to me, so I don't think you did. Like, why don't I know this? So that said, we're going to dive into this, and I present to you, dear listener, Edgar Allan Poe. So, first off, no, we're not doing a Poe reading this year. We did one in 2018. We did one in 2020. So this would have been the year based off the pattern that we have set. But we are not doing it. We're covering him as a topic, which is a pretty good substitute. So I'm just going to start out as if you guys don't know who Edgar Allan Poe is. So if there's any of you out there, allow me to inform you, Edgar Allan Poe was a writer, a poet, an editor, and a rocker of a pretty sweet fucking mustache. If you have not heard of him and you want to hear some of his works, or if you have heard of him and you haven't heard any of his works, go check out our Halloween specials from 2018 and 2020 because we read 2 of his stories. One is The Raven from 2018 and the other is The Telltale Heart in 2020. If you're like, I don't know when those would be on the episode list, The Raven is between episodes 47 and 48 and The Telltale Heart is between episodes 150 and 151.
They're just fun.
They're fun times.
Well, yeah, they're just us goofing around and having fun with reading his stories or poems, his pieces of literature.
Friend of the show and my personal friend for like the last 30 years, Garrett Schultz, helped produce the Telltale Heart episode. It was very fun. So shout out to him if you listen to that episode because he definitely helped out. So as far as Edgar Allan Poe goes, here's some history on him. He was born in 1809. He was born Edgar Poe.
Dang.
He was born in Boston, Massachusetts. His parents were David and Eliza, and they were actually actors. So he came from a line of creative/artist types. Whenever I hear that someone's parents were actors, I always think like, oh, were they successful? They must have been. If not, then, it probably wasn't a good childhood. And like some creative/artist types, he didn't have a great childhood.
No.
His dad bailed in 1810, and if you can do math, that is 1 year after he was born. And his mother actually passed away in 1811, leaving him an orphan.
Oh my God, he was so young.
Old. Yeah, he was. And a John and Frances Allan took him in, never formally adopting him, but taking care of him. And because of that, he took their surname as his middle name, thus Edgar Allan Poe. No hyphen, just Edgar Allan Poe. So that's where that comes from.
I did not know any of that. That's interesting.
I didn't until I did the research. So they took care of him pretty well. In fact, they raised him to adulthood. When he became old enough to attend university, he was only able to spend 1 year at University of Virginia because John Allan, his pseudo-father, was said to be a big fan of gambling. And he was always making parlays on NFL games every Sunday on his app, on his cell phone. His favorite team was obviously the Baltimore Ravens, which is where Poe got the idea for the animal, the raven and the raven. So, side note, not really. I hope no one believed that or even nodded along like people do when they're listening to an episode but not really paying attention, because if you did that, just shame on you. Terrible joke.
Do you know why the Ravens are the Ravens?
Yeah, because it's in Baltimore. And that's where he's from. Well, not really. I mean, he was born in Massachusetts, but he resided in Baltimore. So Edgar Allan Poe wrote a ton of stuff. I've already mentioned The Telltale Heart and The Raven. He wrote The Fall of the House of Usher, A Descent into the Maelstrom, The Pit and the Pendulum, a bunch of things.
Oh, that one's good.
I could list off a lot more. You can always go online and find a bunch of his works or go to these things called libraries. I think that's how you pronounce them, where you can actually just check his books out. Anyways, you could say he was like the Stephanie Meyer of his day, except he wrote suspense/horror/romance, and he was actually talented, and his works were actually good. Side note, if you're a Stephanie Meyer fan, don't at me. Also, based off your taste in literature, I should probably also warn you not to eat crayons or sniff glue. Just kidding. Don't get upset. He also wrote The Murder in the Rue Morgue, which a lot of academic folks consider to be the official creation of the detective fiction genre. He is credited as having created that genre. So
Really?
You're welcome, Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie. He started the genre that these sorts of stories would like be born out of this particular genre. So he's very influential, despite the fact that he, I think, only wound up being 40 years old. Also, he's also considered to be the architect of the modern short story, which is like one of my favorite types of things to read and write, which is so cool. I can't imagine going down in history as the creator of that genre and the creator of that type of fictional work. Like, it's pretty awesome. I could go into more detail about him as an author and as an artist in general, his contributions, his place within the Romanticism movement, but this topic really isn't about that. So if you want to go ahead and learn more about him, he is fascinating and he led a fascinating life. And I would encourage you to look up all that fun stuff. This topic is about sort of him as a person in his personal history, which I've kind of led you into, and less about him as an author. And it's also specifically about the bizarre nature of his death. So I've mentioned some of the things I should say, that he wrote. Lots of things that were dark and macabre, and I put in my script before we made the joke, or macabre, as Robin's sister would say. And you usually imagine someone who creates works like this to be haunted or traumatized by life in some way, shape, or form. Poe did have his issues. There are a lot of places that claim he was a drug addict, but medical records that actually still exist from his lifetime show that he was an alcoholic, but doesn't really support the idea of him being a drug addict, especially since a lot of the drugs that folks were addicted to back then had very specific signs that don't
like
seem to be present, like opium, and there's other things too, and I'll get to some of the other things that he did have in his life later on. He did recover from his alcoholism here and there, but like lots of folks that do have alcoholism, he would suffer relapses. He was fairly famous in his time during his life as well. So when he did wind up falling off the wagon, he would often go out in public very, very shit-faced, and it would basically become news. Like, even though it was like the early 1800s, if he showed up and he was drunk, really fucked up, people would be like, oh my God, here goes Edgar Allan Poe again. He was like the Lindsay Lohan of his day.
He's like the 1800s version of going viral.
Yeah, kind of. I say Lindsay Lohan because we just got done watching Parent Trap like 4 times over the past week because that's just such a good movie. Anyways, so this, combined with the bizarre nature of his death, has left a lot of theories to be circulated about exactly what happened to him, because so much of his time spent in the public eye has this sort of negative connotation of him being fucked up. So let's jump into the final days of Edgar Allan Poe's life. So in June of 1849, Edgar Allan Poe went on a tour to raise funds for a magazine he was planning on publishing. So this took him away from his home, which at the time was Baltimore. On September 27th, 1849, so around 3 months after he set out on his tour, he was supposed to get onto a ferry that was going to take him from Richmond, Virginia, which is where he was at, to Baltimore, Maryland. After getting into Baltimore, Maryland, it was supposed to go on to New York. The night before the ferry was to set sail, Poe wound up visiting a doctor in Richmond, Virginia. He complained that he had a fever. He was seeking treatment because he did not feel well. It is known that Poe did wind up getting treated, and that the next day, on September 28th, he did arrive in Baltimore.
So there are medical records.
I mean, I can't say there's medical records for this specific treatment. Okay. I can just say that he did get treated, and then he did wind up in Baltimore on September 28th. But after that, he did not go on to New York as he was supposed to. He never arrived in New York, and not a lot is known about what happens to him over the next 5 days. He basically goes off the grid, which for someone who was very public when he was intoxicated seems odd. Because 5 days, you imagine that if he went on a bender or relapsed in some way, shape, or form, he would have wound up in public and people would have been like, here he goes again. So after September 28th, people don't really know he's missing until October 3rd hits. So on October 3rd, a man named Joseph W. Walker wound up going to a place called Gunner's Hall. Gunner's Hall is also known as Ryan's Tavern. So if any of you have heard this story before and you're like, Adam, you're wrong, he went somewhere else, it has 2 names, chill the fuck out. When Walker entered this particular tavern, it was pretty busy. In fact, it was busy outside because October 3rd, 1849, was actually election day. It looks like it was midterm elections from what I was Googling. And apparently they used to set up polling stations at taverns and bars back in the day because they figured people are going to be there anyways. You might as well vote. Who cares if they're getting shit-faced?
I was going to say, that's an odd place
right?
to be like, hey, vote.
So, despite it being busy, Walker, while entering the tavern, noticed a man in really ratty clothing, seemingly delirious, in the gutter outside the tavern in the rain. He was barely responsive, and when Walker went to check on him, he realized, holy shit, this is Edgar Allan Poe. So he asked Poe, quote, "Yo, dog, you're EAP, aren't you? Do you have someone in town that can, like, come get you?" And Edgar Allan Poe told him to hit up a guy named Joey S., otherwise known as Joseph E. Snodgrass. Joseph E. Snodgrass was a magazine editor in Baltimore, and he did have some medical training. So Edgar Allan Poe was coherent enough to be like, please call my friend. He can help me. And so what Walker did was he took out his cell phone and he called an ambulance.
Shut up.
Which in 1849 speak means that he literally took out a pen and paper and wrote this letter. This isn't a joke. I didn't make this up. It goes like this. Dear sir, there is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's 4th Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance. Yours, in haste, Jos, J-O-S, period, W. Walker. I don't know why the nickname changed from Jos to Joe for Joseph, but
that's pretty sick-ass writing.
It's kind of sweet. And it's addressed to Dr. J.E. Snodgrass. So apparently Snodgrass was a doctor, or he thought he was a doctor. So Edgar Allan Poe usually wore a black wool suit of some sort. As a person who wears a lot of black clothes, I can understand that. It was his style. It's the sort of thing that he dealt in. Like, that was his genre he really liked to hang out in. So it was definitely notable that Edgar Allan Poe, when he was discovered, was in these raggedy clothes. They weren't black. It wasn't a wool suit. And it didn't seem like they belonged to him. They didn't fit him well. They were super ratty and worn down. So the description of the state he was in from witnesses is also pretty rough. People said he was repulsive, that he was lusterless and vacant.
What?
Someone described him as being in a, quote, state of beastly intoxication. So, like, he was super fucked up. So,
yeah, I was going to say, is it possible he was really, really high?
I mean, that's the other thing. There's no way to tell what was going on, but the records that supposedly existed hint that he wasn't a drug addict, just an alcoholic. So Snodgrass came and found him, and he took him to Washington College Hospital, where a Dr. John Joseph Moran, M-O-R-A-N, would be his attending physician. He checked him in on October 3rd. They kept him in a room that was typically for treating patients who were super fucked up or drunk. So not like the nicer places, but it was, somewhere where he could be that he wouldn't disturb the other patient and could get taken care of. Because Poe was really, really fucked up. He was rambling and hallucinating when he was like semi-awake because he never really came back to consciousness. And Moran and others would ask him, what happened? Like, how did you get in this state? Why are you wearing these shitty clothes? And how did you wind up, where you were in general? And, how'd you get so fucked up, man? And he was never able to give an answer. Now, there's multiple accounts of things that he supposedly said when he was sort of conscious. So we're going to go over some of these things. One account is that he would repeatedly call out the name Reynolds, R-E-Y-N-O-L-D-S.
Okay.
No one has ever figured out exactly who this refers to, but there are a couple theories. So one is that he, in his adult state, was trying to speak or calling out to a Jeremiah N. Reynolds. This particular Reynolds was a newspaper editor and an explorer. Because back in the day, you could just be an explorer and put that on your fucking resume, apparently. Nowadays, you're just called like a bum or a wanderer or unemployed. But
YouTuber.
Yeah, I guess. So this is what this guy was, all right? Jeremiah N. Reynolds was also supposedly the inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's only completed novel, which is titled The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. So folks think like maybe he was fucked up and he was like, where's Reynolds? I need to talk to him, because Reynolds was this dude he had, talked to and known in his life and based a book on. So again, that's just a theory because no one quite knows. Another guess for who Reynolds was referring to is tied to one of the theories that kind of borders on conspiracy theory as to what happened to him and what put him in that state. Some folks think he was actually referring to Harry R. Reynolds, who was one of the judges overseeing the Fourth Ward polls. The Fourth Ward polls were set up at the tavern Poe was found at.
Oh.
So it's thought by some that what happened to Poe was that he was taken by a local gang and forced to vote how they wanted. Like they would, rough him up, beat the shit out of him, make him go vote and say, you have to vote for this person. Then when they're done, they change out his clothes, they send him back in, they make him vote again under a different name, just constantly doing this to just to up the tally for a particular candidate.
Did they not have a system back then where it was like, we need your ID and, you like your driver's license, passport?
I cannot speak to the security of the 1849 elections, but I imagine they had a checklist of give us your name. I mean, I've always heard about these things where in the past, in the way back, people that had passed away that no one knew passed away would wind up voting even though they were dead. So it could be that, or they just intimidated people to leave and said what's your name? And then made this proxy person go vote for them. But in this theory, these gangs would do this essentially to innocent people. They wouldn't do it themselves, which has never made much sense to me. If you're going to be a criminal and you want to make sure the person's getting voted for, why wouldn't you just be what's your name? Okay, get the fuck out of here. And then you go vote, and you keep changing your costume. But either way, the theory is that the reason he kept calling out Reynolds is because Harry R. Reynolds, the guy who was one of the judges overseeing the polls, was somehow in on this. It's said that Gunner's Hall, the place he was at, was a known place for cooping. Cooping being what it's called when a gang forces you to vote repeatedly.
Today I learned.
This theory also states that when you're done being cooped, the gang basically beats the shit out of you and then makes you imbibe a ton of alcohol so that you're just super fucked up.
They leave you for dead, pretty much.
Not necessarily, but they leave you without your faculties, so you can't, express yourself and say, hey, this happened to me. And if you do, people are going to be like, that dude's just a drunk asshole. There's some accounts that say that cooping doesn't actually involve physical violence. It's just intimidation to vote in a specific way. And then, of course, forced intoxication afterwards. There are some facts that I'm going to get to later on that contradict the idea of cooping, which is one of the more well-known theories about what might have happened to Edgar Allan Poe. But let's go back to what he was saying, though. I said he was saying the word Reynolds out loud. It's also thought that he didn't actually say Reynolds, but that he was saying Herring, Herring. Don't know how that's
thought. That doesn't sound...
Yeah, those two mouth sounds are very, very different. And I'll get to you why it is two completely different mouth sounds and why no one really knows. But Edgar Allan Poe did have an uncle in Baltimore whose name was Henry Herring. His doctor, in fact, Moran, stated that Poe had mentioned he was expecting a visit by someone named Mrs. Herring. He also said something about his wife that he thought was in Richmond, Virginia. He did have a wife named Virginia Eliza Clem Poe, who was not actually alive when this happened. So people think maybe he was just super fucked up and he forgot that she had passed away and he was talking about her and his really, really delusional state. He had actually recently proposed to someone named, according to one source, Sarah Elmira Royster. But from what I can tell, she was not in Richmond, Virginia, so that doesn't check out either. Also, there's a lot of debate, or at least there's a lot of conflicting information about who he had proposed to. Some sites state he had proposed to multiple ladies. It's really weird, but we're going to get into it. So this is one of the...
I mean, don't guys do that when they're drunk?
I mean, you keep tossing out that he's drunk. You don't know that he proposed when he was drunk. You just know that he was fucked up at the hospital saying these names. So, and even then, if he was saying Herring, that's not Sarah, Elmira, or Royster. So, Dr. Moran did state that he attempted to cheer up Edgar Allan Poe when he was briefly conscious but still kind of out of it. One of the things Moran told him was that he would soon be, quote, enjoying the company of friends, end quote. Hey, some people are going to come visit you to try and cheer him up. Now, Moran claims that Poe replied to him, quote, the best thing my friend could do would be to blow my brains out with a pistol, end quote.
What?
Yeah. So, everything that Dr. Moran states Poe said is 100% in question because at no point did he actually have any visitors. Basically, all these things about oh, he said Reynolds, oh, he said Herring, oh, I told him this, oh, he said this, that all comes from Dr. Moran. Just Dr. Moran. No one else. He is not the most reliable source of information, by the way, because when Edgar Allan Poe died, people want to know what the fuck happened. So Dr. Moran, being his attending physician and person who had spent the most time with him in the final days of his life, stated at first, we admitted Edgar Allan Poe to the hospital on October 3rd at 5 p.m., which checks out with what his friend said. I found him on October 3rd. I got this letter urgently that said, like, hey, can you get this guy help? I don't know how the fuck it got there so fast. But he took him on October 3rd at 5 p.m. and checked him in. Later on, when Dr. Moran was asked, like, when did Edgar Allan Poe show up to your hospital? He goes, October 6th at 9 a.m. So it's already shifted forward about 16 hours. Is that right? I don't know if my math checks out on that. So later on, people are like, so can you break us down the timeline? And when he broke down the timeline the third time, he claimed that Edgar Allan Poe was admitted on October 7th. October 7th is the day Edgar Allan Poe died. He was found on October 3rd. So as time went on, this guy's accounting of what happened is just all over the fucking place. It's like a person who's telling a story that realizes there's a big audience that keeps adding in a bunch of bullshit to try and make it more sensational in some ways. But
can't they just check his medical chart? Again,
they don't have any records from this time, dude. This is 1849. So he basically stayed in this weird fugue state for 4 days before succumbing to whatever had happened to him. And it's difficult to tell what could have caused his death because he doesn't have a death certificate. There are no records of his time spent in the hospital. There's no documents regarding the cause of death. If they ever existed, which most people think they don't, they have been lost to time at this point. So obviously, it's a very bizarre way for a very famous person who was famous for writing very macabre things, but amazing things, to be honest. It's a very odd way for that person to die. So
I agree.
I already mentioned that cooping is one of the theories as to what could have happened to him. The reason that's in flux is because a lot of folks state that Poe was admitted and sort of started to get better. He started to recover for a little while, and then he got significantly worse. So had he been forced to imbibe a lot of alcohol, it's thought, based off of what kind of happens to people who have been alcohol poisoned, is that he would just continue to deteriorate until he passed away, and that if he was recovering, that means the poison had worked its way out of his system. Because if they forced enough alcohol into him to basically end his own life, the recovery portion is kind of what throws that, into a loop for being a theory. The idea of him recovering, however, for a day or however long it happened for, all comes from, again, Dr. Moran. So this all goes back to a very unreliable narrator.
All right.
In a lot of cases of cooping, the victims would be beaten, but there's no definitive proof that happened to him because there's not a lot of information about what his state was when he got there, aside from the fact that he was having delusions and he seemed really fucked up. You imagine that if he had been, beaten within an inch of his life or enough to take his life, that would have been mentioned more often, but all that's ever talked about is his disheveled clothing and his state of mind. So there are other theories, though, regarding Edgar Allan Poe actually getting beaten up and then, winding up at the hospital all fucked up on alcohol or whatever it was, and also looking like he had been hurt. The claims that say that he had been hurt have a bunch of different things where they state that Edgar Allan Poe is basically beat up either by ruffians that he just ran into in the alley and it was unfortunate, or that he ran into friends from college that wound up taking advantage of him because he had money and then fucking him up in the alley. Or that it was the cooping thing and that they just fucked him up too much after the fact and wound up, resulting in his death. One of the most straightforward theories that I have found is that, he fell off the wagon, he got super, super fucked up, and despite the fact that he started to recover slightly, he had been an alcoholic for so long that essentially it was the final straw that broke the camel's back, and he just couldn't recover. And once his body was just finally exhausted from the attempt at recovering, he just sort of succumbed to the fact that he had, died of consumption. So in 1999, though, this guy shows up named Albert Denay, who argued that Poe's death was caused by carbon monoxide poisoning. His theory is that coal gas was used for indoor lighting in the 19th century, and the fumes that were emitted from it could have caused carbon monoxide poisoning. So Albert Denay actually went so far as to take clippings of Poe's hair and test them for a bunch of different stuff. Those tests came back as inconclusive. So inconclusive in this particular instance seems like it's really just a way of saying he didn't find the results he wanted. So he just stated it doesn't disprove my theory, but it just didn't prove it. Therefore, it's inconclusive. But One of the things that folks don't often talk about when they talk about Edgar Allan Poe is that in July of 1849, there was a cholera epidemic. There was a bunch of cholera that was spreading, which was a very deadly disease at the time, and he had been exposed. So he had gone to his doctor, and his doctor actually prescribed him calomel, which is mercury chloride. When they did these tests that they ran specifically looking for carbon monoxide, it was found that the levels of mercury in his system were extremely high. Now, mercury poisoning actually would explain the delirium and the hallucinations that he was experiencing.
Right.
So basically, he went to the doctor's like, I think I might have cholera. The doctor's like, here, take this mercury. It'll make you better. So he did. That was still in his system at this point 3 months later, maybe 2.5, 3 months later, at elevated levels. I mean, the entire phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from the fact that hatters used to use mercury nitrate to stiffen hats, and
shut up.
Working with that for too long literally made them go crazy. Like, mad as a hatter is an actual thing because they were working with mercury so frequently, and usually in poorly ventilated areas that inhaling all those fumes fucked them up, and it fucked up their brain. So
today I learned.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
I feel like I've even said that on this show before,
no,
but I'm glad that
if you have, it's been so long that I no longer remember.
I'm glad that I was able to refresh that memory for you, or give you a brand new one. So
thank you.
This theory became very popular until folks dug into it and realized that the mercury levels, although they are significantly elevated from normal, which is, incredibly low, we're still 30 times below what would be known as typical mercury poisoning. So that kind of ruled out the mercury poisoning thing. People online still like to claim that's what caused his death. Now, some claims that I found online state that Edgar Allan Poe's condition, once he was brought to the hospital, had lethargy and confusion listed as his main symptoms, and then his condition worsened. He never actually rallied. He just got worse and worse. And continuing to exhibit the symptoms of delirium and then visual hallucinations and then a rapid pulse rate that would fluctuate to be really fast, then really slow, and then suddenly having very shallow breathing. And these symptoms are all consistent with a different disease. In fact, an advanced case of a disease known as rabies. This is actually kind of cool how this theory came around. So there was a doctor that was at a conference in 1996 who was participating in this activity where you get a patient, like patient A or patient B, and you just get a list of symptoms. And it's based off of a historical case study. And you are asked, okay, go ahead and diagnose what's wrong with this person so they can state whether or not you're right. In this particular case, this doctor was given the symptoms of what Edgar Allan Poe was known to have presented with. And after going through all the medical information, he stated this is consistent with someone who had an advanced case of rabies. And the other thing that's worth noting is that rabies was actually really fucking common back in the 1800s and had very few ways of treating it. So, and we're talking about 1849 here. The solution to curing shit back in the day was take this jar of mercury, it'll make you feel better. Or I'll give you an ear nail, or we'll have a blue jay peck out the blood.
When it comes to rabies, though, I honestly don't know a lot about it, but doesn't it make you violent? Or, foam at the mouth type of thing? So
I've always known it to be foam at the mouth, be violent. And then the other thing, which is, those are two things that you could say, he was violent because he was fucked up. But there's not a whole lot of accounts of him assaulting anyone, probably because someone fucked him up. As far as foaming at the mouth, there's no reports of that. But the main thing that people look to as this symptom has to be present for it to be rabies is that you're hydrophobic. You become afraid of water. You don't want water, which I think is actually what leads you to foam at the mouth, is because you have such horribly dry mouth. But he wasn't stated to have been hydrophobic at the time he was being treated, so that sort of knocks that one out. So yet another theory that doesn't really hold water, but people really like the rabies theory in the late 90s, the late 1990s. So if you're gathering anything from all these theories I'm tossing your way, it's that no one really knows what happened to Edgar Allan Poe. We have a lot of theories. We have a lot of guesses. Some of them educated. In a lot of cases, it's just could be that or it couldn't be. So the last one I'm going to throw at you is something that I found that was pretty sensationalized back in the early 2000s. So in the year 2000, a book came out called Midnight Dreary: The Mysterious Death of Edgar Allan Poe. And in this book, its author, who's known as John Walsh, and no, not that John Walsh from America's Most Wanted. Different guy.
Oh, okay.
Walsh claimed that the brothers of Elmira Shelton, who Elmira Shelton is supposed to be the other chick he was engaged to, this chick's brothers were like, we don't want Edgar Allan Poe marrying our sister, so they're going to decide to convince Edgar Allan Poe to fuck off. So again, apparently this guy did a bunch of research. He pulled a bunch of letters and memoirs that were authentic from the time about this engagement and this chick's brothers not liking Edgar Allan Poe, and some newspaper articles about this situation. And he put that into his theory that Edgar Allan Poe had these three guys after him. And the reason that he was like completely off the grid for 5 days between September 28th and October 3rd is because he was hiding from them. The reason he was in these disheveled clothes that don't look like him is because he was wearing a costume, so they would leave him be.
That is a pretty good theory.
Right? At some point, they catch up to him, and they fuck him up, and then they dose him with a bunch of alcohol because they knew he was a recovering alcoholic who had serious issues. That said, there's no way to prove this. Just like everything else, there's no way to prove that that's actually what happened. It's just a theory that came out that people thought, man, this makes a lot of sense. But the academic community that really likes to go through and say what happened to one of the greatest authors, of the 19th century are like, this is another theory that has no proof based off of the things that we know and the things that, were presented when he went to the doctors. All it states is what happened to him in the mysterious 5 days he was missing. And I guess this really brings me to the final point I'm going to make of this topic. There really is no way for us to know what happened to Edgar Allan Poe. It was a tragic and early end for an incredibly talented man. And if you're like really wanting to think about how talented this guy was, we have read 2 of his stories on our podcast. Not only did podcasts not exist, but like the entire medium that we transmit through like didn't exist when he was around. Like, it's insane that he passed away 170 years ago.
And we're still talking about him?
We're still talking about him. His works are still relevant and fucking beloved. People love his shit, And what it really comes down to is this mystery, will never really be solved. We're never going to get an answer that's definitive to the bizarre nature of his death. And people are always going to come up with new or revitalize old theories of what could have actually happened to him. All we know is that, he passed away, and it was sudden and it was sad, and the world misses him. And, the things that he left behind are things that we treasure. And, after I read this, and I already kind of knew that he died in a mysterious way, but I read, all the theories. It just really has that feeling of like people have been looking for a sense of closure since this happened. And the only thing that makes me feel good about the fact that it was such a bizarre way for his life to end is that it keeps people talking about him. And, people can hear about the mystery and then decide, I'm going to go read some Edgar Allan Poe and dive into his work, because it was all fucking awesome. Like, it's all super cool. And just talking about it and going through the list of his stories, I'm like, I want to go back and read some of this shit. So that said, like, my personal theory on what happened to Edgar Allan Poe is that I don't think he actually died. I think he just decided he wanted to be out of the public eye. He was like, I'm tired of the attention.
Get out of here.
I just want to disappear for 5 days. And then people are probably recognizing him here and there. And he was like, you know what? Fuck this. I'm going to fake my own death. So he just got super drunk, went to a hospital. He's like, hey, don't let anyone else in here. And then he told Dr. Moran, like, I'm going to leave, tell everyone I died, make up some shit. And Dr. Moran was like, all right, I'll try and get my story straight. And that's why he kept fucking up his stories, because he couldn't keep it straight. And then Edgar Allan Poe just decided to fuck off and just live a normal life. Or he was a vampire. I kind of like the idea that he was a vampire. No. Like, he got bit.
None of these things are obviously the answer.
He got bit. He had to stay away from the sun for 5 days. It was cloudy and rainy. He wandered outside, but he was still super fucked up, so he collapsed in the gutter. They took him to the hospital. They didn't know what was wrong with him because he was changing into a vampire. And then at some point, he probably passed out. They came in, stethoscope or whatever. They checked for his heartbeat, and he's like, oh, he's dead because his heart stopped beating. Nah, dog, he's just a vampire. And then he disappeared. And maybe he's out there still, and every now and then he writes a short story or a novel and releases it under a pseudonym and just pretends like he's one of those authors that doesn't want to come out of hiding, like a J.D. Salinger type. But
I don't know who that is.
The Catcher in the Rye guy, who is just like a notorious hermit that never comes out and does public appearances or anything. But that's my theory, because I like the idea that he's still around and he's just putting stuff out into the world. But who knows? Anyways. That, my spooky friends, is the bizarre end of Edgar Allan Poe.
I think the story of his death is absolutely fascinating. There was so much to that I did not know before, like all the drugs, that, like the mercury that they made him take, to try and make him, quote unquote better. I really like the theory of that girl's brothers chasing him and he's just trying to get away from them. I had not heard of those. I'm just like mind blown that there were the one that I'd heard of the most is them using him to vote. I know there's a movie with John Cusack where he plays Edgar Allan Poe.
It's called The Raven, right?
Is it? I don't remember. I just know they show him dying at the end, but some guy finds him on a bench and that's the end of the movie.
I've never seen The Raven. I do remember when that one came out, and I think it's about people getting killed in ways that he had written about.
Yes.
But yeah, I've never watched it, even though I fucking love John Cusack. He used to be my favorite actor.
Yeah,
we should watch it. I agree.
Yeah. But yeah, no, thank you for covering that. I really enjoy it. I really think his death is fascinating and curiouser the more I learn.
Indeed. So hope you all enjoyed it. But yeah, that's it for this particular episode. If you have
enjoy this tasty long one.
Yeah, enjoy this tasty long one, Robin says.
No, I mean, enjoy this tasty long, episode for your ear holes.
Cool. If you have a story you would like to share with us, it doesn't need to be about the tasty long one, or it doesn't need to be about Edgar Allan Poe or any of the stuff we've covered on this particular episode. It could be if you want. Not about a tasty long one, but, supernatural, spiritual, coincidental, extraterrestrial, true crime, or, just whatever you want to share with us. Feel free to email storytime@scaryish.com or go to our website, scaryish.com, click on contact us. Has a form there you can fill out. It comes directly to us, or hit us up on our social medias. Twitter is @ScarishPod, Instagram is @ScarishPodcast, and Facebook is facebook.com/ScarishPodcast. Robin, for folks who would like to donate to us, how can they do so?
You can go to patreon.com/ScarishPodcast. Those are monthly donations. Tiers start at $1. You can also go to Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/ScarishPodcast. Those are one-time donations if you're not into the monthly subscription type thing. But yeah, we're really thankful you guys have stuck through us. We know we're a little inconsistent right now. But we're trying. We're gonna keep making content. Adam's working hard. We're to release some more stuff for you folks, and yeah, hopefully you guys have a great Halloween.
Indeed, have a fun and safe Halloween. You will hear from us next, I believe, on November 2nd. Although we should have some extra stuff coming out, pre-recorded stuff, but extra stuff coming out this weekend leading up to the spooky day, which is also Robin's birthday. So if you're out there, everyone yell happy birthday, Robin, as loud as you can, and she will feel that energy over the next 7 days. So that's just about everything we have for episode 247. So Robin, go ahead and sign us out.
Keep on creeping on, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Bye-bye.